Hello, and welcome to the Faith Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the fourth Sunday after Pentecost for the week of July 6th, 2025, and I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig in this week's podcast, and I am excited that here we are in this growing season, as I like phrasing it here, this season after Pentecost, and it's a challenging season in that we have to continue to go through these different texts that allow for us to be thinking about how are we going to continue to grow? How are we going to continue to move forward? And I know for me, as I talked about a little bit last week, it was challenging based off the weather that I had experienced. There was a major changes in the area that I'm in Bemidji, that there's just a lot of things that are changing. There's a lot of progress that has happened over the last week, but it's also just change and accepting the change. There's nothing we can do about it now. It's the recognition that Mother Nature is going to have its way and things are going to change. And that can be hard. There is a moment in continued times to mourn that. I know my wife and I have been talking about it. We have relatives coming up, and there were plans and things that we had already been anticipating for months. Some of these things are just not able to happen now because of the major blowdown that we had here. And in that, it makes us reflect and think about in ways of there are times that we get ahead of ourselves. There are times that we forget things about ourselves. There's times that time moves forward and we recognize I am not the same person that I once was, but that's still okay. And there's times to mourn that, but there's still also hope that comes from that. Bemidji, as it's gone through its major transformation over the last week, there's a lot of places that now are getting sunshine that didn't have sunshine before. There's reimagining of what the city can potentially be now after this blowdown. And I think these are good reminders for us on these drastic changes that happen within our own lives. Things can change, and how we look at things, how we adjust to things can also modify how we're moving forward with things. And that plays into the question that we had for last week, which was, where are you getting out of your comfort zone in your faith? And I know I had one of the loyal listener respond with talking about their cleanup from different storms and things, and recognizing the age that they're going through and how they had at different times had done all these different things for preparation for storms, and recognizing at the age that they're getting to that things are changing. And I think that's a great reminder for all of us. It's easy for us to remember back to who we have been and what we have known and what we recognize or want to define ourselves as. But it's also the recognition of things changing. Like I mentioned last week, I am not the same runner that I was in high school, and that's okay. It's healthy, but also recognizing that there's different skills and abilities that I have now that I didn't have at that point. And there's times that I'm leaning into that a little bit heavier, and thus my running isn't the same that it was at that point. And I think that's where we start looking at the holistic side of us. And I think it also helps us to expand our vision on who God is, and recognizing if we're this complex, it allows for us to get a more complex vision on who God is. So let's just jump into it. The one of the Old Testament texts this week is from 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 1 to 14. I really enjoy this story, and it's something that I think we can really dig into here. We have the commander Naaman, and he has part of King Aram's army, and they've been capturing the tribe of Israel, and they end up taking one of these girls captive from Israel, and he has leprosy. And so she makes this comment about, if you were following my Lord and with the prophet, he'd be able to heal you. And so then he goes to the king, and the king writes these letters, and he kind of gets passed around here that he goes to the king of Israel. He gets all stressed out about this, and Elisha hears about it and says, send him my way. And so finally he shows up with all the pomp and circumstance of horses and chariots, and Elisha just says, go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored. And Naaman is quite upset up by this in the aspect that, one, why couldn't I use one of the rivers closer to me that are cleaner? Jordan was not exactly known as a clean river, and is just kind of coming up with different excuses. And one of the servants finally says, why aren't you doing this? It's easy. And if it doesn't work, what's the harm? And after the seventh time of washing in the Jordan, his flesh is restored. And I think that's a really important thing for us to be reminded of, how often it is for us and easy for us to complain or procrastinate or put things off or say, why does it have to be this way? And thus, when you really get down to it and someone looks at it and it's like, it's really quite simple. Why are you complaining about it? And I think that's an important lesson for us to be thinking about in general. And we'll jump into it a little bit this week. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 30, all 12 verses of it. And this is then a psalm of talking about this restoration aspect of God, recognizing that when we cry out that God restores us and is able to then give us a thankful heart to give thanks to that, and recognizing that we might go through hard times and that there might be times of frustration or things of that nature, but recognizing that God then is the one who is able to restore us and thus make sure that we don't die because of our aspects of getting caught into that, turning our mourning into dancing, taking these things that are trials in our lives and giving them into praise. The other alternative Old Testament text this week is out of Isaiah chapter 66 verses 10 to 14. This is recognizing how even in difficult times here, Jerusalem still needs to rejoice and recognize the blessings of what God has extended to the people of Israel at this point, and recognizing the gifts around them that has been given from the river, recognizing that these have allowed for the tribe of Israel at that point through Jerusalem to be able to prosper. And so this recognition of the gifts of what God has given us and acknowledging that and making sure that we are giving praise to that. Which then leads into the psalm that ties with that, which is Psalm 66, the first 9 verses of it. And this is then recognizing the power of God and giving praise to God, and recognizing then that the whole earth is this acknowledging of the worship of God and how we can see it all around us as we continue to go about it, and then are able to recognize that the praise that the earth is giving and making sure that we don't ignore that. The epistle text or second reading this week is out of Galatians chapter 6, optionally the first 6 verses, and then 7 through 16. This is beginning here and recognizing how we need to be able to carry each other's burdens and working that this is not something that's supposed to be isolating, that we are carrying them on our own, but recognizing that then we should be sharing them with each other. And this then doesn't lead to that we should be mocking each other because of these. This is one of these things that as we are able to work together and help carry these, we recognize how much more we are actually able to take on, and thus we are able to move forward and work together on. And instead of taking things and criticizing then about each other, and this is a way where Paul is getting at talking about the circumcised versus the uncircumcised at that period of time, but recognizing instead of seeing the differences, recognizing that we are supposed to be part of one big family of God and working together to see how do we carry each other's burdens to work through these things and work together toward a common goal. The gospel text this week is out of Luke chapter 10, the first 11 verses and 16 through 20. And this is a text where then Jesus is beginning to send people out. And we get this recognition of 72 others being sent out in the towns that Jesus wants to go, but he isn't able to get to. And we get the very popular verse here in verse 2, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, ask the Lord of the harvest to send the laborers out into the harvest. Go on your way. I am sending you out like lambs in the midst of wolves, getting through verse 3 there. This recognition on how there are going to be difficult things that you're going to experience out there, and Jesus gets into that, and recognizing don't let that defeat you, but continue moving forward. And this is one of those moments then of also recognizing that in doing this, in working together, in going out and sharing in this news, that it's something that ends up propelling the love of God further and further into the creation that God has anticipated, and thus Satan losing more and more control of what is going on because of the gift of what God has done through sending us out and being able to proclaim that message. So, before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do a shameless plug. Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their Sermon Brainwaves podcast, their commentators' discussions, since I'm the ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some different ideas and directions to look at for these different texts. And especially with their back catalog that they have, it gives you a lot of resources there, and there's just a lot of great information over there. So, if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but also having the art, prayers, hymns, colors, daily devotions. There's just a lot of additional great resources over here at Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, and I think it's an amazing resource to be able to help supplement and get you prepared for that upcoming week. So, if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend that as well. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publications. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies to be brought up into your weekly preaching, similar to like this type of podcast. And if you're enjoying listening to this type of podcast week after week, I know you're going to enjoy a lot of the different resources that are over there. So I'd highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publications. And that'll be the first link down in the references section. I find it interesting that we get the story of Naaman this week with Jesus sending people out. And I think that combination is a really intriguing one to be thinking about. Here we have the idea of Naaman needing to be restored and having this recognition of sending people out to, one, acknowledge what is going out there and to heal it. So what does that mean? How do we do that? And I think as a person who is trained in ecology, I think this is a skill that we are losing. And with losing it, we're actually making it more difficult for us to fulfill the mission of what we've been called to do. And we can see it here even in the Luke text of what we are called to do. I think it's intentional that Jesus is sending people out 2 by 2. Personally, partially, it's always good to have a partner, be able to share each other's burdens like we talk about earlier in the text, how we are supposed to be working together in that way. But also within science, it's very common to have where you're having multiple people looking at things because you're having different sets of eyes, different ideas, different things to bounce off each other to see, is this worth our time and effort to think about or to dive into a little bit further, or have we thought about this hypothesis, or why is it reacting this way? With Jesus also sending this amount of people and sending them out ahead in pairs, there's also the recognition of what are they going to see? Not only the people, but the landscapes, the towns, the villages, the roads, the trees, the birds, the animals. What are they going to see? And especially as we are talking about, and we see in the Psalms this week, that the earth is giving praise. Is that not also part of what Jesus is wanting these people to be able to see and recognize? Is to acknowledge and think about as they are going out to try to heal people, to better connect with the broader environment in and of itself, to be able to give us a broader perspective of the whole of what God has created, and giving praise and homage and recognition to that, not just the human race. This is where I think we fall short of that. And it's one of the things that I know I kind of circle back around to, but I think this is something that is really important, is we are told that creation is singing praise as well. So are we then acknowledging and spending that time out in creation to see and recognize that praise? Because if we are, then we'd also be recognizing the places where creation cries out, where creation is in need of help. Now, one of the things in the last century and a half, and it's relatively new, is species reintroduction. And there has been a lot of discussion back and forth because there has been some that have been extremely beneficial and have been extremely helpful. We've talked about like Yellowstone, for instance, with the reintroduction of wolves and going through like all the Leopold's thinking like a mountain and how it got the elk to move around, helped to end a lot of the erosion that a lot of things were going on, and just helping the ecosystem as a whole by adding in the top predator yet again into the ecosystem, and it drastically had a cascading effect all the way down. And that is very true, and we can definitely see that in other places where that has happened with other animals or plants or things of that nature. And in fact, plants are actually one of the better species reintroductions where they have a higher likelihood of being successful. But what defines success? That's a whole nother thing, and I'll attach a link down below kind of going through papers talking about and thinking about how are we going to define success with reintroduction of species. But I think, again, one of the things that is being learned as we are contemplating and thinking about how do we reintroduce species, or do we do that, is the amount of time that has been since the last time that they were there. And how has the ecosystem adapted to them not being there? And that's just one of the variables that we have to start thinking about. One of the other things that then you have to start thinking about is if you are like reintroducing and you're starting from ground zero, as we've talked about before, you know, your genetic variability is quite low. You have a bottleneck population in that there's just not a lot of genetic variety. And so you're more likelihood to have some issues potentially coming up because of how close the inbreeding would potentially be. As we talked about before, okay, ecological symmetry. Is there something else that has come in and filled that role of something being gone? Or is it a big gaping hole within the vast ecological web that we are dealing with? How are we reintroducing these species is another thing to be contemplating and thinking about as well. Is when we're thinking about, okay, are we bringing them out of captivity? Are they going to be able to adapt well? And we talked about this type of thing, the whole process of like what specifically like the International Crane Foundation ended up doing with helping with imprinting and recognizing how birds imprint and trying to make sure that they weren't getting imprinted with humans. But the aspect of when you have a bird or an animal in captivity doesn't necessarily mean that they're just suddenly going to immediately transfer well into the wild. There's a lot of things that need to be contemplated and considered when you're making that jump. And these are all things that we have to consider and think about, and especially now as you are looking at reintroducing species back into these areas. But this gets back to what I was stating initially, is I don't think we have done this well, because we shouldn't be getting to this point. If we have gotten to this point where we're saying that we have reintroduction, that we need to figure out how we're bringing this back in some form or fashion, that they have disappeared. How well have we actually been going out and observing and recognizing something was in pain, something was hurting, and that we needed to go in and help? We recognized when maybe it was too far gone or was an extremely small population that it needed to be adjusted right now. But where were we before that process? And this plays into a little bit of what we talked about last week, is the reason I would argue as human beings that we weren't recognizing is that means that we have to extend beyond our comfort zone. There's still areas of this country that are very concerned about, well, what happens if I reintroduce wolves or reintroduce bear or reintroduce some of these top predators? The way in life that I have established and considered doesn't necessarily work. And that very well could be true. But it's the aspect of then also having to adapt. And it's not that you can't do that. It maybe means that the way that you are doing it can't be done in the same way. And it means that there might be some additional work and contemplation and thinking about, and also looking at it from a broader perspective of what is that actually doing for our whole ecosystem, not just for us as individuals. And this gets back to that whole idea initially of Jesus when they were sending him out 2 by 2. But I think we then fall into the Naaman predicament. I don't want to change. Do I really have to do this? Why would I do this? This seems dumb. It seems insignificant. A lot of simple science in a way of just doing observation is vastly important. If we've talked about plenty of times on this podcast before, but thinking about the Audubon Christmas bird count, what is it? It's simple observation, but documenting it and recording it and compiling it. And from those simple observations, you're able to get a much bigger picture of what's going on. From those simple observations, we are better able to understand, at least at that time and at that place, what is going on. And if you compile enough data, which the Christmas bird count has by Audubon, you're able to look at trends. You're able to notice things. You're able to then start looking at and thinking about how do we then actually do some good conservation projects based off of data that we're looking at. Maybe there's something that we need to look into further to be able to see why is there suddenly this change that hasn't been here. And especially when you're able to go back over 100 plus years with the Audubon Christmas bird count. Those types of observations are vastly important. But that also means when people are coming back and saying, we need to change our habit about X, Y, or Z, because this is the observation that I'm noticing. And the more and more people that are able to confirm that observation, instead of us as the human side of us saying, well, this might mean that I might need to change something. Instead, looking at it as an opportunity of, well, maybe this gives us an opportunity to better understand the whole creation and understand new aspects of God and how all these different parts are playing together. These are hard things for our brain to wrap our head around. And again, I'm talking in broad terms here ecologically, but that's the aspect of a lot of what ecology work is. And it's sometimes it gets very frustrating because people want the specifics, but if you get so specific, you're only talking about one small area, and then people are saying, well, you're not being broad enough. Why would I do something that's only affecting this community? But we can recognize it as a larger trend, but we can't then get to the specifics as easily. If we're really going to share one another's burdens, I think then we also need to expand that out to be able to recognize the burdens that are around us that aren't human. Recognizing the plight of a tree that's maybe having a good year or a bad year. Looking at the aspects of the different diseases and things that are going through them and how are they faring with it. If you're having drought in the area where you're at, how is that faring? Spending time and recognizing those observations are keenly important. It's a silent cry that comes out. The silence of something not being there. The silence of what used to be plentiful is suddenly not there is powerful. But then also having enough respect that when we are confronted with difficult challenges, that we react. We make a difference. One that is interesting that the area in which I'm in has to deal with is with where radars sweep. Bemidji is one of the least covered areas for radar. Where the sweeps are and the curvature of the earth makes it extremely hard to predict. Did that factor into our storms from last week? Maybe a hair. But it's also this aspect of re-seeing that this is an issue and something that needs to be looked at and considered to be able to better understand and get more data in some way to be able to help people in a simple way. One of the other ones that was quite tragic was one of the areas that we went to last weekend after the storm. There were 2 bald eagles that were flying around and crying out. And from people who had spent more time there observing, They said the reason they're crying out is they've lost their nest, and they had 3 young, and they're all gone. The tree is destroyed. And so when I'm driving around and seeing the pain and the hurt, and yes, it's reported that amazingly there was no injuries of humans from the storm. There were still other casualties that are harder to report because they don't necessarily have the same voice that we do. The animals that maybe sensed something and went away, but also the different birds and bird nests that got blown away that we never knew about. The different habitats that different animals were depending on that suddenly are not there. Is there still hope and still resurrection that will come from this? You bet. But there's also the recognition of things that are changing as well, and the hurt that is also going on. I think the thing that I would say is this is a challenge for us to actually get in better touch and communication just with the world around us. And it doesn't have to be a big area, but maybe it's just connecting and really getting the pulse and the heartbeat of the area in which you're in. The smells, the sights, the sounds, what typically happens. Recording it mentally and maybe even taking a journal so that you can notice the changes of what's going on. So the question I have for you this week is, how well do you know your, quote, community around you? And that community is your nature community. How well do you know your community, nature community, around you? Because if we don't have to get to these places of reintroduction, it's for the benefit of everybody. But it means that there might be sacrifices that we have to do beforehand that may seem silly, that might seem ridiculous, that might seem like, why do I have to do this? And we recognize that it's to the benefit for the long term. And the hard thing with that is we may or may not see the evidence of that. But is that not what we're accustomed to in certain ways also? When you plant a tree, you don't expect to see necessarily the whole life cycle of that tree. You're planting it with the intention that it's going to outlive you. You're planting it with the intention that it's going to help somebody else or something else down the road beyond you. So how do we make that a daily practice within ourselves? How do we make that a practice that becomes just all-encompassing so that we can recognize the pain and hurts that are going on as well? Sometimes the praise is easier to hear, but the pain is what really needs to be dealt with. Jesus sent them out 2 by 2 to help carry the pain, carry the burdens, and it was talked about in Galatians that that's part of what we are doing. And sometimes things are going to seem hard, sometimes things are going to seem easy. Sometimes it means going out and recognizing and acknowledging the praise that's going on. But it's also meaning that we also have to confront ourselves and be real about the pain that is going on as well. It's not all good. It's not all bad. It's figuring out and being real with each other. And sometimes there's going to be more hard things than good things. And sometimes there's going to be more good things than bad things. But being real about that, being honest about that, and actually confronting that is a major part of this. I don't feel like this should be controversial with us connecting with the creation of God. And I will say that I feel like there's something that is coming that I'll eventually be able to announce that I think plays into this podcast a little bit more, where we'll talk about it a little bit further, and you'll understand when that comes out. But I think it's this idea and this recognition that this isn't just our place. We're here for a period of time, and we are told to take care of it. And sometimes that might mean us doing some things that seem crazy, ridiculous. Why are we doing this? But also recognizing as we are doing this, we're not doing it alone. Doing those simple things of planting a tree or starting a native garden or trying to reduce how much of our fossil fuels that you're consuming or looking at small habits do make a difference. And especially as you're able to work in small communities to build to something bigger, we then actually feel like we do make progress. But it takes all of us working together to be able to do that. Is it difficult? Sure. Is it possible? Yes. Will there be a lot of difficult decisions along the way? Yes. Will there be failures along the way? Yes. But is that also part of what we are trying to learn and grow as we better understand who created all this place? And what does it mean to have these ecosystems working together in harmony? I would argue that that is part of the point. Because I think there's a lot of things that those ecosystems have to teach us if we're willing to listen to the praise and the pains that they have to say. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.